VenomousStare returns with the This Week in Fantasy series. This is the Week 3 preview, and this is going to be a solo episode. The last few episodes have run very long, and I know a lot of people sort of skip around and find the very 2-hour long episodes arduous to get through, so this one's going to be more quick hitting. So last week, we had Seagouch take the Cursed Lands division lead with a win over Lily. We had me take a victory over Weston to drop him to 0-2. And then in the other divisions, we had some interesting action, including Spencer getting a victory to 1-1 and Aaron falling to 0-2. And a real barn burner between Benny and Cam. So let's get into it. We can talk about Weston versus me. Now, this was an interesting matchup because Weston historically has browbeat me very badly, but I have been doing a lot better as of the last couple years. And Zach Moss failed to perform, he got hurt. Julio Jones didn't do well. He was struggling with injuries and actually got shut down by a weak Cowboys secondary. And that Cowboys game, of course, was extremely tumultuous. It looked like the Cowboys lost due to aggressive play calling and sloppy play, but they actually were able to recover an onside kick, which is nearly unheard of in the modern NFL. In the NFL as it stands now, the onside rules got changed a couple years ago, and since then it's very, very hard to recover an onside kick. The onside kick has basically been taken out of the game. The kickoff has basically been taken out of the game, as football has dwindled down to a husk of what it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago even. I remember a segment on ESPN not 10 years ago called Jacked Up, prelude to Monday Night Football, the hardest hits of Sunday. Not only are segments like that gone, they're almost seen as taboo. It's almost like you're reveling in someone's injury if they get hit hard, even if they don't become injured on the play. So it's a big reason why football is a lot less fun to watch now, along with ad spam. And another reason why it's really gone to shit is the penalties in general. The penalties in general on the defense have gone up, even the stuff that doesn't have to do with hitting defensive players. And the league has gravitated towards this idea that it's more offense that people want. If we just officiate defense out of the game and focus on promoting offense, then people are going to be happy. And I think that's sort of a foolish notion, and a notion that is preached a lot by journalists and talking heads in a lot of different sports. You see baseball, runner on second and extra innings, stuff like this. People want shorter games, more offense, and it's not really necessarily the case. Not that people want to see defensive slugfest, but people don't want to see mindless score fest where the defense can't even play. Worth noting here, Spencer told me to get Jordan Reed, and I basically said no matter what he said, I wasn't going to do because it was live on an episode. And Jordan Reed went off and O.J. Howard went flaccid. Justin Tucker is proving to be a good kicker because Baltimore is going to do very well offensively pretty much every week. The Cardinals did well against Washington. Dwayne Haskins is just clueless. Drew Brees, even though he's a big name and a guy you would want in real life, he's a guy that I feel like doesn't really have a high ceiling in fantasy football with the running back situation and Taysom Hill and all that nonsense. Kareem Hunt, of course, did very well going into the week. And as for Weston, Edelman might have done well as Kelsey, but the top half of his team underperformed. Derrick Henry got a lot of touches but didn't punch it in despite a Tannehill victory. Tannehill, the quarterback of Tennessee, really just led that team to victory. Super efficient. The Ryan Tannehill line you've come to expect. 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, high completion percentage. So I took this match at 108.98 to 78.9. And if we scroll over to the other matchup in this conference, or not really conference, but division rather, we can see that Seagouch dispatched with Lily despite Russell My Jimmy's Wilson, continuing his career as an exceptional fantasy quarterback, an efficient guy who is more explosive than a Gardner Minshew or a Ryan Tannehill, and a player who uses his legs more than both of those players as well, which makes him a top-tier fantasy option. He almost solo carried Lily here, who had Todd Gurley start and didn't punch it in. Dallas, of course, fumbled a lot, shot themselves in the foot, and is known for their weak secondary more than their more weak against run. And more importantly, Saquon Barkley, a de facto first-round pick and workhorse back, went down, blew his knee out. He's out for the year. He's been dropped. He's done, 100%. Diggs actually did well, of course. He was playing Miami. Buffalo gets to play Miami twice a year. That's a godsend if you have anyone in the AFC East when they actually get to play against Miami. It's a must start. Diggs actually showed up, unlike Will Fuller, who you could argue cost Lilly the game because Mark Andrews' tight ends are more hit or miss. And Robbie Anderson looks very good in that Carolina offense. He looks like he's going to be the first option. The Pats managed to do a little bit of damage in terms of getting a turnover and interception, but whenever you give up 35 points, it's hard for the defense to carry you, and what this really comes down to is Saquon Barkley blowing his knee out at 28 yards. Lilly loses by less than 10, and Amari Cooper notches 10 for the Gouch. Kenyon Drake gets around 10. The Asian kicker for Atlanta gets 15. Colts got 15. Minnesota just looks clueless. Last season, their offense was pretty damn good. Lots of 3 tight end sets, lots of ground and pound, lots of running the ball, folks. They were really a squad that shoved it in your face. And this season, they look very inept. They had an interception-filled offensive performance last week. I'm very interested to see how Minnesota does this upcoming week in Week 3 that we're previewing. So Seagouch took a solid win and took a 2-0 lead in the division. Now, of course, in fantasy football every season, both of the division teams play each other in the opening 3 weeks. So after Week 2, a lot of times you get in positions where a team is 2-0 and the other teams can sort of be fighting it out. But this is one of those situations where Seagouch is, in fact, at the top of his division at 2-0. So good start for Christian, who was 2-0, being known for getting second place. And this was an incredibly close game when Worlds Collide versus Clap4, the commissioner. Clap4, who started out 0-1, gets an incredibly important victory here, very narrowly over Austin, the new member of the league, the newest member of the league. Kyler Murray really has been a linchpin of Austin's team. Now, whenever you look at Austin as an owner, you have to consider a few things. He's a Texas Tech guy. Notice I didn't say alum, but he's a Texas Tech guy. And Cliff Kingsbury, of course, is coaching the Arizona Cardinals. This was a guy who rode 7-7, not literally 7-7, but 500 seasons in college football at Tech, as well as his handsome visage to a tenure. Got a quarterback job at USC that lasted as long as Brett Favre's first retirement, and then the dude was on to Arizona to coach Kyler Murray into becoming a potential two-way athlete. Nah, screw that. We got the best offensive mind in football for you, and you're going to become the best quarterback in the league on an offensive-based team with a very aggressive coach that's going to build around you. And that's what we really saw in Arizona. And with AB being a Texas Tech guy, big reason why I drafted Kyler Murray, who is sort of like Russell Wilson in the sense that he's going to be able to air it out a lot and be able to rush. And of course, rush yards for quarterbacks in fantasy football scale 1 to 1, 1 point for every 10 yards. That's why running backs are so valuable. That's why rushing quarterbacks are so valuable. Consider this. It's much harder to get yards passing-wise as far as how they translate. So if a quarterback can get 50 yards rushing every week, it makes their ceiling spectacularly high, and it makes their floor spectacularly high as well, because you'll have quarterbacks who reel off a couple of big rushes, and suddenly that's like the equivalent to a touchdown and a half. And it makes it really hard for quarterbacks who even lose games or have mistake games where they throw a couple of interceptions and end up really losing it for their team. It makes it sting a lot less fantasy-wise. That's really the crux of why running quarterbacks are so good. And that lengthy explanation was in fact necessary, because when you look at a guy like Kyler Murray or Josh Allen, if you compare them to like a Drew Brees or a Brady, maybe you wouldn't want them in a playoff game if you were the general manager of a football team, but on a fantasy team, they're stellar. Robinson, the running back for Jacksonville, has done incredibly well. James Robinson, of course, he's basically taken the workload over from Leonard Fournette, who was a guy who really just mysteriously dipped out of town and got replaced. That's something that we see with running backs a lot in the NFL. This is a narrative that has been building over the last 5 years, and it really began with Todd Gurley's knee issues. It's that you don't want to overpay running backs because they get hurt. It's more important to pay top-tier linemen, guys who will stand up year after year and protect not only your running back but your quarterback. And your running back success is sort of predicated on your line's talents. Even if the running back is top tier, if the line is garbage, it's hard for them to do very well. And we saw players like Zeke Elliott right after Todd Gurley get a huge contract. And a lot of people have come to the conclusion that running backs are a disposable commodity. You draft one, you use them up. There's not a lot of difference in terms of peak skill and floor skill. And what's really more important is locking up a defense and an offensive line. And that's the thought process that Jacksonville went with, as well as the Rams, And really that has paid off for Jacksonville, even though they did lose last week to Tennessee. Two stylistically similar teams, Tennessee and Jacksonville. Two teams that love to ground and pound, have mistake adverse quarterbacks in Minshew and Tannehill. Two guys that I think are actually very underrated within the league in terms of being able to lead your team to a winning record and being consistent. This Clyde Edwards-Helaire guy that Austin drafted, a rookie, a very hot rookie, you have to remember at the time of the draft, as Thorin says, you always have to contextualize things. And going into the draft, this was a hyped rookie, but this wasn't like necessarily a Saquon Barkley hyped rookie. It was known that he was going to get the touches. There wasn't going to be any sort of Shady McCoy time sharing going on. And I'm just thrilled with this pick for Austin, because even though he only got 7 points this week, this is a guy who has really just been a cornerstone of the Chiefs' offense and is going to get his. And AB really has what I would call a dirty hedge, or more accurately what Spencer would call a dirty hedge, and the fact that he has Tyreek Hill at receiver. So any receptions, or really any sort of touchdown action that doesn't go to Clyde is going to go to Hill. And since Austin is the biggest Chiefs fan anyway, if you're a super fan of a team and they have an extremely high-powered offense and you can afford to get a couple of the weapons and fanboy out a bit, yeah, go for it. If you're going to watch the games every Sunday and you're a Cowboy homer, and it's impossible to do this in a league of Cowboy homers like we have, but maybe you get Amari Cooper and Zeke somehow, a first and a third round, late third. That'd be great. But this is an extremely intelligent thing to do by Austin, because Tyreek Hill is an extremely high-risk, high-reward guy, and if you couple him with another Chiefs weapon, you're sort of offsetting that. Because the chance of the Chiefs getting shut out or completely shut down is very low. We saw them get out to a very rough start against the Chargers last week, and it was very slow goings for them early, but notice that both of these weapons combined for a plus 20 total for Austin. Juju Smith-Schuster, who looked great in the opening week, failed to get 5 this week despite Pittsburgh winning. And Sammy Watkins, who, very funnily, in the beginning of the Chiefs game, Austin texted me a screenshot, and it said Sammy Watkins won, and it showed his receiver on the bench, T.Y. Hilton, with 2.8, and it showed both of those, and it said, and of course T.Y. Hilton was locked in at this time because it was an afternoon game for Watkins, and he said, send this screenshot to Spencer, because Spencer and I both, but more Spencer so, had said, T.Y. Hilton is obviously the better play over Watkins, who is a boomer bust guy. Sammy Watkins is a guy who literally for the last 3 years I've been saying the same thing about. He has one really good week. He's poison. He's fantasy poison. He has one good week. You plug him in and he shits the bed for 2 weeks. And he's an extremely boomer bust guy. And in my opinion, I don't care if he's on the Chiefs or the Chargers or the motherfucking Jets. You're only plugging this guy in when you are on bye weeks as a flex, and you know he's boomer bust, and you know he could get you one. And yeah, he did have injuries issues in this game, but he's had injury issues his whole career. And really, it doesn't change the ethos of his whole career being a boomer bust guy. And the funny thing is even though AB had texted me that, oh look, T.Y. Hilton locked in for 2.5, Watkins already has one, Spencer's an idiot, LOL, I'm on my way to victory, because Watkins is going to punch it in for me. Watkins didn't do shit, and AB narrowly lost, and unfortunately for him, learned a little bit of a lesson, not about humility, because fuck humility, but about Sammy Watkins and boomer bust players. So unfortunately for AB, he does go down in this game. And if I look at this game overall, a few other things that jump out at me is the Ravens defense smothering Houston and getting 15 points. You would expect the Ravens to do well against Houston, but, you know, Watson is no scrub there, the quarterback for Houston, Deshaun Watson. This guy's a damn good player, especially for fantasy, and he looked pretty rattled in that game. Houston didn't look good. Tyler Lockett got a touchdown, as you would expect for a top-tier receiver, and not necessarily top-tier like Michael Adams or Michael Thomas, or not Michael Adams, you know who I'm talking about, Packers receiver rather. But he's a guy who's the top option on his team, top tier in that regard, first on the depth chart. But Miller for Chicago has just been a fraud this year. Anthony Miller, he did reel in a touchdown in the week 1, but this is an extremely high-risk guy with big dick Mitch Trubisky throwing to him. And even though he is the number 1 depth chart option on his team, you really don't want to be relying on Chicago options if you're a fantasy owner. Same with Detroit. You know, Detroit really hasn't had a significant fantasy start option on a weekly basis since Megatron, and they've really struggled in that regard. And Trubisky is just so inconsistent personally, hamstrings his team. Notice Tom Brady didn't have a good fantasy week, despite leading his team to victory. Sort of file him in the Drew Brees category of great in real life, but not going to really put up huge fantasy numbers every week. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn the music off so we can pound through this. So, nice little win there for Clap 4, and we're going to move on. And the music was cute while it lasted, but it's a little bit much with one person, I feel like, so. One thing about these matchups is every one of them, except for mine, had incredible drama and was up in the air going into Monday night. And that is one really exciting thing, because half the time when you watch these fantasy matchups, a lot of them are decided by, 2 p.m. or they look like they're going to go one way definitely. So this is a very exciting week. Now crucially here, Spencer scored 108.98, the exact same number as me, which is very bizarre considering we score out to the hundreds. Cam Newton, another great week. Cam Newton, of course, was starting Sunday night, and Spencer really needed Pete Cam Newton to come through here. And he did. He got Pete Cam Newton, but unfortunately, Jackson really came back on him just as hard. Robert Woods found the end zone, oddly enough, on a rushing touchdown. Calvin Ridley stomped all over the weak-ass Cowboys defense, as I predicted. And on Jackson's team, Chris Carson finding the end zone, I feel like, is going to be a win condition for him going forward all year. Because even though Carson netted 100 yards this year, or this week, he's not a guy that you can really count on yards-wise, I think. But Lamar Jackson did get 17, and Jackson took this victory over Spencer. These are widely considered to be two very talented owners. Interesting that even though Jared Taylor got a ton of touches and Miles Sanders got 17, or it's Jonathan Taylor, not Jared Taylor. Both these guys got 17, and Spencer still couldn't crack a W. Devontae Adams, who I called Michael earlier foolishly, got hurt and went flaccid. Of course, Michael Thomas is hurt, so perhaps that's why I confused them. And Spencer traded for Zach Ertz, who, great big name. This is a guy who you would, in the past, rank up there with a George Kittle, a Travis Kelce, but hasn't really been so this year. And Michael Gallup, only 58 yards, outperformed by Aaron's receiver, CeeDee Lamb. Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb, of course, the Cowboys' 23 receivers. And Aaron, who of course is 0-2 this year, and one of the most long-time owners in this league, has a prop bet with Spencer on guess what? Michael Gallup or CD Lamb, who's going to do better this year. So Jackson takes the victory there, and even though Spencer does well and puts up almost 109, takes the L. So this was sort of the game of the week in terms of context and rivalry, and going down the stretch, this was the game to watch. So Spencer and Ben, two of the three twins, as Coach Corbin deemed us, me being the third, and I ain't talking XCal. These guys had a knockdown drag-out. Jared Allen popped off, 400-plus yards, 4 touchdowns, got 20 rush yards to prove a point, 35 freaking points. But Dak Prescott was 1v9ing against the Falcons. This guy punched it in 3 times on the ground, which absolutely blows if you have one of the Cowboys' weapons. CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, Amari Cooper, Zeke Elliott. I mean, that's just absolutely hamstringing your team when you see Dak Prescott jam it up the gut. But good for him carrying the Cowboys to a game they just needed so desperately after not only an abysmal game 1, but an abysmal first half. Joe Mixon, guess what? He got 8. That's what Joe Mixon's going to do all year. And if you're lucky, he'll queef out a touchdown and get you 15. That'll happen like once. Melvin Gordon got Cam Joke 15, and Alvin Kamara found the rushing touchdown ledger twice. Big reason why Drew Brees put up a pedestrian performance. And whenever you draft Alvin Kamara, these are the games that you really bank on. Lots of receiving yards, finds the end zone, gets a tons of looks, and this along with Dak pretty much solo carried Cameron. Because even though you might see a 140-point team and say, well, how the hell did Cameron, the lowest regular season win percentage owner in the league, get 140? How is that the story? That should be the story? I say no, this is the story. A.J. Brown, a guy ruled out about 5 days before Sunday when he played. This was a player who Spencer and I sardonically spent about 5 minutes discussing whether or not Cameron was going to be able to switch him out on time despite it being the most laughably obvious linear decision possible. And he didn't. And in week 2, that's repugnant. And obviously Cameron had other options to go with here on the bench. And this guy, Marvin Jones, was really going to be the top tier target on his team that week because the Lions don't run the ball and they had injury issues. So it was very funny that Cam put up 140 because going into the late night games, this was one of those things that Ben was actually able to win, and Cameron just had Chimera left, who of course just went off. And that was the night where the Dallas Stars lost versus the St. Louis Blues. I think that was game 4, and that was the game where the Stars were down 0-3 very early, and Chimera punched it in for the first points of the game. So Ben was very miserable that night. That was a rough night for Ben. So even though Ben puts up a very good total here, 126, and was poised to go 2-0 and shut the haters up, the people who have been saying he's checked out, he lost to Cameron, who not only is just, you could honestly say, the worst owner. I think if you took a vote, people would come to that conclusion. And if you looked at the numbers, that's the obvious conclusion. So Cameron won and put up a phenomenal performance despite the shit for brains. And this is just brutal for Ben. Remember, had 25 points locked in going to that night. Very, very, and by that night I mean, after Thursday at 25. Scary Terry got 18. Mike Evans found the end zone after being shut out the previous week. This was just rough for Ben to lose, and for Cameron, honestly a lucky win considering he couldn't even field the lineup properly. So, gotta have your shit together there, Cam. Finally, we had Aaron putting up 115 and losing. Another exciting game going into the final few matches. Gardner Minshew sort of hamstrung Aaron with 2 interceptions. In the first week, Minshew showed absolute perfect accuracy, but those 2 interceptions cost Aaron, who lost by less than a point. Well, I guess it's a little over a point, but less than 2 points. Mahomes did his thing, got 27. Fournette found the end zone twice, despite Spencer writing him off as a brain-dead fraud. And I wasn't high on Fournette either. Of course, I'm starting Jones for Christ's sake, but I wasn't on Spencer's level where it was like, wow, like why are you starting this guy? I mean, it's only week 2. If you went with Fournette, you can't give up on him yet. Eckler had over 100 total yards. Thielen shit the bed versus Indy in a repugnant performance by Minnesota. And if I look at this team overall, one thing that sort of jumps out at me is the Steelers did well against Denver, and Denver isn't really going to perform very well all season. They have sort of an anemic offense, and anytime your defense can get you over 10, that's just a huge helper. And obviously for Aaron here, Aaron Jones just did everything he could to 1v9, and that just came up short. Dalvin Cook found the end zone. This is despite Minnesota being awful, so Minnesota's awful, and Dalvin Cook finds the end zone. Minshew gets 20 plus, and the other running back gets 40. So how does Aaron lose? Emmanuel Sanders, who was wide receiver 1 over the injured Michael Thomas, put up a repugnant less than 2. This is simply putrid, folks. I mean, just filthy. And even though he got 8 targets, a 1.8 going into Monday night on a really cut and dry moment where you can look at that and say, well, Michael Thomas is God tier, and Emmanuel Sanders is going to get his targets presumably. He's got to get at least 5 points, which is all Aaron would have needed. Didn't get that. Didn't get shit. And vexingly, CD Lamb got plus 10 and he still lost. Greg Olsen should have used his third leg and gotten more than 0. Tough loss there for Ramp, who, even though he dominated the regular season last year, is an appalling 0-2. And one thing that I heard Spencer say last week over and over, not like he was repeating himself or he was damn or bad or anything, but definitely a point he made and something he believed was, it's hard to come back if you start 0-2. You don't want to fall in an 0-2 hole, so that's something Aaron has to consider, and something that when you put up 115 and still lose is pretty vexing. Let's go ahead and review the games. Now, a lot of people might float the question, well, why did Wiley wait until Sunday morning to do this? And I've talked about this in the last episode, but I'll briefly reiterate. If I do these episodes during the week, people don't have their lineup set, and I'm sitting there half the episode going, I wonder if he's going to change this guy who's Q. I wonder what this guy's status is. You sit there half the episode not knowing, and it's sort of a joke. Also, I was trying to get some guests on, and couldn't really line up schedule-wise. Next week, I expect there to be a guest the entire time. But this week, solo episode, mixing it up. And let's start with the rematch of the Super Bowl. See you guys tonight. So Green Bay is playing New Orleans tonight. And one thing about doing these TWIF episodes Sunday is I do them with the intent of that sort of 10 a.m. to 12 a.m. Central Time, where everyone is waiting on tenterhooks for the game and excited, or maybe going to or from church, all one person. But a lot of people are really excited and lusting for football content, and will even watch some of these terrible pregame shows on network television. So I think that if I upload these episodes Sunday morning, maybe a couple times, people will be more willing to sink their teeth into them, especially like the 30 minutes or so before the freaking games start, because that's just miserable. You're watching ad after ad after ad. I mean, they really deep throat you with those ads in the pregame for 30 minutes right before the actual matches start at noon. So weird, I could just say noon before, and now I have to mix in CST because 2 of the owners are out there in the Mountain Time Zone, which is sort of funny. So, tonight, the premier game, Sunday Night Football, is going to be New Orleans and Green Bay. This is going to be a great matchup, 2 exceptional quarterbacks, Hall of Famers, but I do not really expect Drew Brees to light it up. I expect him to put up about 19, and that's the fact of the matter. Carson Wentz has a better matchup, faced some pretty weak Cincy. They look way less hapless with Joe Burrow. And, I think Cincy will win about 5 games this year, and they really have a future with that kid Burrow. But defensively, I'm really not feeling their pass defense. Wentz isn't really that good, and really, when we have hindsight now, we can sort of make the judgment. Nick Foles wasn't that good either. They were both sort of above average. Now, I'm not saying either of them are bad. Obviously, it just said they were above average for Christ's sake. But people were touting Wentz as an all-pro, top-tier guy that deserved the money. And then when Folk won the Super Bowl and carried them, it was, wow, Nick Folk's the shit, actually. He's the S-level top-tier guy we should give money to. In reality, they're both a little above average. See, God likes to do the name gimmick, though. You win some, you lose some. I don't know if I would hitch my wagon to Carson Wentz, though. Zeke Elliott versus Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake is on what is really becoming a high-powered offense, and even though it's a pass-focused offense, this is a guy who will get his looks and doesn't really split time with another back, so he is, however, dwarfed by Zeke Elliott, a top-tier, primo, ground-and-pound back behind a great line. Cowboys are going to have a lot of trouble with Seattle this week. They're playing in Seattle wretchedly. The crowd isn't as much of a factor with the Corona joke. But Zeke Elliott, one thing about him is he's one of the guys who splits the least amount of time in the league. Tony Pollard doesn't really touch the ball for shit. When Pollard does come in, they pass, and they're a rush-focused team. So Zeke has a very, very high floor. Kareem Hunt is a guy that a lot of people dismissed because of Nick Chubb, but he has done reasonably well both weeks. Last week, of course, had a mammoth week, a lot of that coming down to finding the end zone twice. And Kareem Hunt, I feel like, is a guy who will receive enough receiving and rushing looks to be a viable number 2 receiver. And by receiver, of course, I mean running back. Josh Jacobs is just filthy, and even though he's a little banged up, you know he's going to get his looks because Gruden loves to run the ball. Gruden's an old-school cat, and Jacobs, you can rank him in the upper echelon of non-timeshare guys. For years, this is how we've viewed fantasy football running backs. You have to look at them in terms of what are the amount of carries they're going to have taken from them by other running backs. And when you look at Josh Jacobs, when you look at Zeke Elliott, the answer, not many. These guys are going to get theirs. OBJ, remarkably healthy 2 weeks into the season, facing off against a soft Washington defense. And I know if you look on mobile, it'll say number 2 defense versus, and you shouldn't put a lot of stock into those things early on in the season. Odell Beckham, I think, is going to get over 10 this week. Keenan Allen, even though he is the primary number 1 receiving option, I'm not a big fan of the Chargers, although Carolina has looked wretched. If you were going to start Keenan Allen, if you were going to bank on him getting a dozen, this is the week. Carolina's offense has looked how I expected it to. See, that's why I need a guest. It's for moments like that. So, Keenan Allen, he'll get his targets, but in terms of actually legitimate deep threat, big numbers, 160 receptions, this guy's not going to be worth the money he's making in real life. Odell Beckham Jr. definitely gets the edge. But if you're a Carolina fan, it's going to be a season of suffering, let me tell you. The people who build Teddy Bridgewater as passable, yeah, they were right, but you have to consider Bridgewater was passable in an offense full of weapons, and now, after going 0-2, Christian McCaffrey is hurt, and it's not a 1-week injury. So if you're betting against Carolina, you should feel good. Carolina is about to enter a very dark period, and any chance of them going 9-7, going 10-6, like a lot of the Bridgewater apologists forecasted, there's no chance of that. They're not going to have a good year at all. Amari Cooper is facing off against Seattle. The Legion of Boom is long gone. Expect 10 from Cooper. I don't really expect Dak Prescott running the ball in to be a consistent pattern. That was more of a weird game-based thing. So if you're a person who owns the other Cowboys weapons, like a Zeke, like a Gallup, like a Lamb, and notice I didn't mention a tight end. Because Blake Jarwin, he gone. Sorry, Rampy. And the other tight ends they have are god-awful, so don't expect Dak to run it in a bunch. But he is a quarterback who is very lethal on a bootleg, so it's not like if you look at a Tom Brady or a Breeze, we almost never expect them to get rushing touchdowns. Anyway, DeAndre Hopkins gets a lot of looks in a pass-heavy offense, even with a lot of other good receiving options. Detroit has a soft-ass receiving defense. Hopkins, you've got to pencil him in for 14-plus here. You drafted him as a top-tier option. You don't feel as good about him as an Adams or a Thomas, but both of those guys have struggled with injuries this year. So if you look at the receiver list, Hopkins is really high up there. And I think you don't necessarily feel as good about him as you did when he was a Houston Texan, but you still feel good about him. And considering he's on a Cliff Kingsbury offense, in a way you feel better because there's more options offensively. You're not really going to double him as much. You're not going to be able to know he's the only deep threat if you're a defense, but if you're a fantasy owner, you know he's probably going to get more targets in terms of they're going to run more pass plays with a Kyler Murray. Although, even though dumb Bill O'Brien still thinks it's 1988 and he wants to ground and pound, Watson gets his looks. Anyway. Delaney Walker, very talented player, overcoming his drug problem last year. Very solid tight end, and he notched a tutty and a hundy last week, and he's going to play. Of course, if you missed that, he's expected to play, it says so. He'll probably do better than Jordan Reed, who Spencer correctly predicted to do well. And Spencer, one thing that he mentioned that is very true is San Francisco doesn't really have shit for receivers, so anytime you can go ahead and grab the tight end option, that's part of why George Kittle has been so good. Kittle predicted to play last week, didn't. Predicted to play this week, and he's out. I picked up Reed because fuck O.J. Howard. It was one of those things where I had Spencer on the show, and even though whenever he said, well, there are better options than O.J. Howard, I knew he was right. I sort of had to come out and say, well, whatever you say, I'm not going to be able to do it because it's right here on the show. Like, say it for the show, but even though I know you're right, I'm not going to be able to follow up and do it. And I told him that right after he said it. Okay, like you're right, Jordan Reed will do better than O.J. Howard, and he did. He went way off. O.J. Howard didn't do shit, and because Kittle was still struggling with a nagging injury, I said, well, fuck O.J. Howard. Might as well get Reed, because as Spencer pointed out, whenever you take a backup of a top-tier guy like Kittle, especially a guy like Kittle with no receivers to compete with, it's a very linear decision. You're just able to start the one guy that's healthy. Makes it a lot easier on you. Especially when you consider times. If Jordan Reed wasn't playing noon, then it would be harder. What if he was playing Sunday night and your first-string guy was playing at noon? Or not your first-string guy, but your backup that you would have to put in the first string in place of him was playing at noon. They play at the same time, it makes it easier. Ronald Jones, this is a guy that some people were really high on. Of course, in the preseason it was said they would be really focusing on him backfield-wise in Tampa Bay, but last week he looked a little soft target-wise even though he knocked in a touchdown. So people aren't really high on Ronald Jones, but I think that the Ronald Jones-Fournette will be more of a 50-50 than a one-guy winning out type thing. Spencer was so low on Fournette last week that he was like, why is he starting him, LOL? And he was so low on Jones in the preseason, he was like, I don't know why you drafted him. It's going to be Fournette. So, in truth, I really think it's going to be more of a 50-50, but that's just running back-wise. The crux of the issue about Tampa Bay is you have to consider Godwin and Evans are going to get touches too. And that's the real reason why the running backs aren't that good. Not the other guy. Fournette versus Jones or Jones versus Fournette. That's just one of those offenses where there's a lot of mouths to feed. Gronk, of course, even though he didn't do shit last week. And if we compare him to Joe Mixon, we're pretty much saying Venomous, is Ronald Jones going to get more than 8? And against Denver, it's pretty pushy. I'm feeling like Ronald Jones is probably going to get 6 or 7. Joe Mixon's going to barely outdo him. Maybe Joe Mixon will even punch it in. But Philly has a really good run defense, so probably not. And they'll probably get about 5 or 6, I would say. Justin Tucker and Koo, these are two guys that are part of offenses that really use the kicker a lot, whether it be in field goals or after touchdowns. Love both of them. Chicago's defense, not as good as it was 2 years ago. And I'm looking at this saying, I feel good about both these guys, 10+, honestly, straight up. That Kansas City-Baltimore game Monday night will be exceptional. Two very good quarterbacks. Very happy that the NFL, even though we saw tons of injuries in week 2, I mean, just Christian McCaffrey and Barkley, of course, being the main two guys, but Adams and Thomas before him being dinged up. I just hope that the NFL doesn't fall into what we saw Major League Baseball fall into, where there's just a plethora of injuries, and you really just see a lot of top-tier guys not doing shit because they're hurt. Cardinals defense playing inept Detroit. I was thinking about how awful Detroit has been fantasy-wise since Megatron left, and it's really depressing. And speaking of depressing, imagine being Megatron and playing your whole career there to the point where you pretty much just have to rage quit your career and retire. Love this Colts pickup against the Jets jokes with no Lev Bell. Adam Gase has no idea what he's doing. This is an inept offense. The Colts here could pop off for 10 plus. Great pickup by Christian. I think that Christian gets a slight edge here, honestly. I think that this will be a game where both teams do well. This will be a game where both teams really look back at this in the latter weeks and say, okay, well, this was an important game tiebreaker-wise. Landry doesn't have a lot of value with OJB being healthy. Lev Bell pretty severely injured, not going to be back for several weeks. And without him, the Jets just are a joke. Jimmy G not going to be playing, which hurts Reed's value, which hurts Kittle's value. Not that he's playing, but just hurts San Fran overall, which is a big reason why Seagouch gets the edge. I don't think he'll blow me out, but I do think he'll win. Always important to be honest on these previews. Matt Stafford and friends versus One Johnny Football, please. It sort of vexes me this name is in all lowercase. Russell My Jimmy's Wilson will light up Dallas. You can pencil him in for a big game. Big Dick Mitch Trubisky doesn't really have very much talent, even though Atlanta can't really stop anything. I honestly think Trubisky will get over 15, but I'm definitely feeling Wilson against that matchup. The Ancient, Adrian Peterson, will be facing off against Mike Davis, a guy that I put a waiver wire claim in for, as well as a couple other guys, and didn't get. You know, it figures I lose week 1 when no one gets hurt and there's no one worth picking up, and I win week 2 when pretty much several significant people get hurt, and there's a ton of good waiver wire pickups, and I submit 4 and get none. Brutal. Mike Davis was the one I really wanted, though. Carolina just has such a low ceiling quarterback that they're going to run the ball a lot. Just a great pickup by Weston. Very active on the waiver wire. He'll definitely outperform Peterson. Although, like I said, Carolina would be low on them. Gurley, I actually think will get over 8. I don't think that even though Atlanta put up 39 on the Cowboys, Gurley didn't do shit. I actually think Gurley will do better against Chicago this week. Derrick Henry facing a pathetic Minnesota team. He'll get at least 12. Definitely going to edge Henry in the spot. Jamison Crowder out. Obviously, I'm doing this episode. You can see the time here. It's 8:30. This was an obvious out. This guy got hurt in the middle of the game and was the reason why Lily lost. Oh, it's just so obvious. Replace him with just someone. Just someone. I would say Robbie Anderson. But even though I said the Carolina Panthers are going to falter. Allen Robinson, definitely a guy you're gonna start with one eye closed here, even though they're playing terrible Atlanta. I just have to give the edge to Robinson here, even because Crowder's out. Wiley, why do you do the TWIF videos on fucking Sunday morning? Because of shit like this. Imagine if I did it Wednesday afternoon. It'd be horrible. Stephon Diggs will outdo this guy, Deontay Johnson. Got a touchdown last week, basically vulturing off of Juju. He won't do much this week. Juju will get the looks. Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce. This is sort of an interesting mirror. Definitely going to edge Kelce here, although I think both will have a good week. Galladay's questionable. He's expected to play. Julian Edelman popped off last week. Cam had a great week. I'm definitely going to edge Edelman, as it appears as him and Cam are developing a rapport. Gostkowski's facing off against Minnesota. And weirdly, Gostkowski is the kicker of Tennessee. Isn't that just fucking weird to see? Another guy that should just always have a Patriot logo. Him and Tom should have just played with the Pats till like 2024 and retired. But I don't have a lot of faith in Minnesota. They're reeling. They don't really get the home field advantage they've become accustomed to. And I just think Gostkowski's going to have a good week, but when you look at Gonzalez playing against Detroit, he's going to have an even better week. Detroit is just feckless, and they have been for years. Matt Stafford's going to go down as one of these guys who was just above average season after season, but played for a shit team. Bucks are facing Denver. Pats are facing Vegas. The Pats' defense is better, but Denver's worse. I'm going to have to push there. And I would be surprised if any of these two people are watching this at this point, but man, I really just think that Wilson's going to have a phenomenal week. It's sort of irritating, this Crowder here. It like makes a mockery of TWIF, honestly, but I understand it because I fucked with my roster at 11 the morning before, but usually I'm really hungover, and Lily's like a 18-year-old girl, so I don't really think they're the same. It's hard to give a edge here with the Crowder being out. I'm just going to... Damn. I'm going to edge Lily. I think Wilson will carry her to victory, and I think Weston's team looks sort of inept. Jackson and Clap 4. This is an interesting rivalry because Jackson was a little bit antagonistic in the preseason of the league when it came to the format stuff. So this is a matchup that I think a lot of people have been looking forward to, and it's a bummer that it happened in Week 3 instead of Week 1, but let's get into it. Lamar Jackson is going to have that quintessential marquee matchup versus Kansas City. I expect him to get 25. Deshaun Watson, I expect to get 18. Honestly, the Texans haven't looked that good. Deshaun Watson is going to rush enough for him to have a low floor, so it's not going to be bad. But Mark Ingram is a guy who, even though Deshaun Watson does a lot of running, will still get his looks because Baltimore runs sort of like a weird wishbone-y offense that it's not like anything else in the NFL that you see, honestly, and it's very interesting to watch. I remember a game last year where they played San Francisco, and it was just a lot of weird run packages, and it was very interesting. Speaking of San Francisco, Jared McKinnon has gotten 10 plus each week, and that other guy, Raheem Mostert, got banged up last week. McKinnon looks like he's the primary guy of that backfield, even though it's sort of a fuck fest and is pretty much like a 2 and 3 way. And look at that, Mostert and Coleman both out. So you really have to rely on McKinnon here. Remember, San Francisco using a backup quarterback. The Giants suck floppy. I mean, just shove all your chips in on McKinnon here. And if you're picking people for like those daily fantasy challenges, pick McKinnon. This guy is going to have a big game. Tyler Lockett facing Dallas is another guy who's going to have a big game. I edge Lockett. And if you look at Woods, yeah, he had a big game last game, but the Cowboys secondary rather is just shit tier. Godwin facing Denver and Calvin Ridley versus Chicago. Chris Godwin he was banged up a little bit last week, remember, but when I look at Calvin Ridley, I look at a phenomenal pick by Jackson, a guy who is number 1 ranked in receivers this year because even when Julio Jones is hurt, the motherfucker gets doubled. And what happens? The Falcons are behind. Their defense is bad. They air that bitch out. Even when they have a good running back, they don't like to run, going back to the days of Devote Freeman and Michael Turner. And guess what? Calvin Ridley finds the end zone. This is a guy who can be viewed, as far as I'm concerned at this point, as wide receiver number 1 from Jackson. And Godwin is a guy who was phenomenal last year, top 5. Goes way down with all the new options, the new offense. Godwin, believe it or not, is actually a better player, fantasy-wise, with the crab thief throwing to him than Brady. Because with Brady, they're going to be in more games. They're more likely to go 10-6 than fucking 6-10. And because they would fall behind with Winston, and Winston would air that shit out, Godwin would get tons of garbage time. Now, Tampa's a legitimate football team who's probably going to be a playoff threat this year. And it's because of TB12. But that's changed his outlook as a fantasy player. This isn't the guy he was last year. Ridley gets the huge edge. Evan Ingram versus Noah Fant. You know, Noah Fant, even though he's gotten 10 and he's found the end zone the last 2 weeks, I think he's going to fall off a bit here. I think Evan Ingram will actually outdo him. One of the Giants receivers is nicked. I think it's Sterling Shepard. I'm not completely sure. Evan Ingram, a guy with pan hands, doesn't really have a lot of talent. Just given one chance after another and fucks it up. But I think he'll have a good week versus San Fran. Deshaun Jackson, this is a guy who's been around forever. He was good in Philly like a decade ago and then like ate shit in Washington, and now he's back in Philly and still eating shit. But he'll probably do better than 3.4, let's be honest. And we can move on to kicker, where Robbie Gould is facing the Giants. He'll crush. Vegas will do decent against New England, but you have to edge San Fran. And if we look at the defensive matchup here, you can't imagine the Ravens are going to do well against Mahomes. But the Browns are facing off against clueless Haskins, definitely edging Browns. And this is a close, interesting matchup and somewhat of a rivalry matchup, but because of the McKinnon situation, I think I'm actually going to slightly edge Clap for. Between McKinnon and Lockett, I think that both these guys are going to have solid weeks, 95 plus, but I do not think that Jackson is going to be able to achieve victory. I think that starting this Jacksonville receiver, I mean, he got 6 targets. He was playing weak-ass Miami, but wasn't a fan of it. Hindsight 2020 is part of doing TWIFs on any day after Thursday, where I can say what I thought, and people are like, well, you already saw the points, but whatever. I'm going to give the commish the edge there. So here we have a very important matchup between two teams that are 1-1 and really want to try to get atop their division. And we have Spencer riding the Cam train. Spencer talked nonstop about what he was thinking about Cam in the preseason and how excited he was about it. And as far as Cam performing well, Spencer turned out to be right. Cam has revitalized his career. I think getting out of Carolina helped him, although I'm not sold on Cam's longevity just yet. So we'll see how that goes. But as it stands, Cam's looking very good. Kyler Murray's looking even better. He's facing off against a soft-ass Detroit defense. Murray's going to air it out for 25 plus. I think Cam will get 18 plus. Miles Sanders, after he was dinged up initially, he really showed fans who drafted him in the first round and early second round that he would be worth it. He's facing Cincy this week, although with the incredibly good pick, James Robinson already being established here for AB with 2 tutties. You have to really imagine Sanders, even though I think he will do well, won't eclipse 25. 2 really powerful backs here. Jonathan Taylor, who just got a ton of looks for the Colts last week, really touted to be the number 1 guy, facing off against AB's namesake, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And this is a very potent, powerful matchup. And the crux of the issue here is that Clyde is going to be facing a Baltimore defense that is not only stout, but the Baltimore offense is going to be putting up points, and this isn't going to be a run-out-the-clock type game. This is going to be a game a lot like the Week 2 matchup Kansas City had, where they struggled against the Chargers, and because of that, they didn't run a lot, and because they I'm just laughing at the Jets guys and Adam Gase's ineptitude, I'm sorry. Because Jonathan Taylor's playing the Jets, he's going to get a ton of looks. This is a guy that just grinded the rock last game. The Colts are a middling team, but the Jets are a laughingstock. The Colts are going to get ahead. Taylor is going to run a lot, and Taylor is going to put up, mark my words, 17.5 plus. So I give the edge to Taylor. Michael Gallup versus Tyreek Hill. Hill is hard to predict because he's a straight-up over-under guy. It's sort of like the Jimmy Payton. I'm just going to stop talking because fraud. But anyway, Michael Gallup. This is a guy who has struggled initially with CeeDee Lamb getting the looks, or Michael Gallup not really getting so many of the looks because Amari Cooper is the number 1 guy. And you really have to consider how much Dak was just running it in last game. But Michael Gallup, I still think to be a threat. Definitely worse than Hill, though. Hill is a guy who, imagine Sammy Watkins with like double the floor. That's Tyreek Hill, and like I guess a little higher ceiling. And he's like twice as talented IRL, but we're talking fantasy here. Traquan Smith was picked up for Spencer, and Traquan Smith was sort of the guy that got the catches instead of Emmanuel Sanders, as Aaron languished during Monday Night Football. But I got to edge Juju here, who I expect to get a dirty dozen plus. Tight end here for Spence Worthless, already locked in for 7.5. A guy I've never heard of, honestly, Mike Gieske, who did the typical tight end thing of basically getting 1 catch, but it's a touchdown, so you're fine with it. Remember, Spencer traded for Zach Ertz. He's facing off against Cincy's defense, but he plugged and played this guy versus Jacksonville. Got him a touchdown. And this is, I think, if you wanted to talk like 30 minutes ad nauseum about the history of tight ends in fantasy football and what you would really expect from them, if you got down to the end of the documentary and came to the conclusion, the guy at the end would just say, as long as they get a touchdown, it's okay. So even though this guy got 15, I'm going to give him the advantage over TJ Hawkinson, who got around the same amount but found the end zone in week 1. Not a fan of Detroit's offense, as I was speaking about earlier. David Montgomery rushed 16 times last week. And Chicago's offense, it's a little below average, but they do run the ball a decent amount. They're up there in the north. Trubisky turns it over a lot, so they're sort of forced to. Malcolm Brown was not very good last week. He was, it's the Rams' backfield. It's weird for me to sit here and predict who's going to do what. I think it's sort of a crapshoot. I think that everyone's a little injury prone. And I think that, like, even though Todd Gurley has been traded, he's like a great representation of what it is like to be a Rams running back. How could an offense that passes so damn much have so many running back issues? Advantage Montgomery, even though Brown has such a high ceiling. And if we look at the kickers, Crosby should have a barn burner versus New Orleans, and it's a mirror matchup. Both these guys are going to get plus 10. You know, if they don't get plus 10, it's going to be because the game's 35-28, and they just don't kick shit for field goals. Bills are facing LA. The Saints are facing Green Bay. Don't feel great about the Saints start there. The Saints are a good team, but they're not a team you really think of it as a defensive powerhouse. But regardless, you look at this matchup, and it's an interesting one. It's a one with two teams that have done well in the opening 2 weeks. It's a matchup with a plethora of weapons, and it's very hard to call in my opinion. But I'm going to edge Austin here. I think that because of his receiver advantage and the already locked in 25, he does get the edge, although it's very close. Here we go with Cam, who hasn't watched a minute of TWIF in a decade. And by a decade, I hyperbolically mean 2 years, against Aaron, who was phenomenal last year and is 0-2 this year, and it looks as though he is in danger of losing to Cam and going down 0-3. And if you think that Spencer is being hyperbolic and a drama queen about saying that it's hard to climb out of an 0-2 hole, you might be right, but as far as an 0-3 hole goes, no, that's terrible. Because already you're borderline splitting the tiebreaker with everyone in your division, and you're going to be banking on a tie a lot of the time. It's very tough, as LeBron would say before he took his talents to South Beach. Not one, not two, just the two. Anyway, Dak Prescott popped off with all the rush touchdowns last week. Expect people like Zeke and CeeDee Lamb and Gallup to find the end zone, because if Deke keeps punting, it's way harder to talk for like 2 straight hours than it is to just bounce questions off people. Let's be straight here. If Dak punches it in like that every week, it's going to just ruin fantasy for a lot of people. It's not going to happen. Dak isn't a guy that runs that much, and like I said, he's more of like a guy who excels out of the bootleg than a Watson or a Jackson, who is just phenomenal scrambling. He's not even a guy like Tony Romo, who I would say is like really good at scrambling and improvising. Dak is more good at like, I'm going to bootleg, and if nothing's open, I'll run for 6. Great. That's sort of like the ABC, what the offensive coordinator tells you to do, read, more than like Tony Romo had more of a off-the-top guile he played with, a gunslinger mentality, or a guy like Michael Vick, who was just so incredibly offensively and athletically talented. He could just force those things and look for those things, and defensive coordinators had to plan for him. With Dak, it's just like he knows how to slide, and he doesn't take unnecessary hits. That's almost more of an asset than his quote-unquote ability to run, because his ability to run ain't that great, just like his pass accuracy ain't that great. So Did Dak pop off last week? Fuck yeah. Is he going to have below 25 this week? Hell yeah. Would I bet that he even had below 20? Well, I think the Cowboys are going to put up a lot of points, so I think that would be a tenuous bet, but, 17, 18 is about where I would put him. Now, certainly he's going to outdo Minshew, who shit the bed against Miami somehow. What an appalling loss for Jacksonville, who, if you look at them on paper, is a team who, in a lot of ways, is aiming to sort of be 9-7 or 10-8, or 10-6 and sneak in. I said 10-8 because in my head I was thinking they're actually going to finish 8-8, but they're hoping for a 10-6. If you take a guy like Minshew, who is billed as an Alex Smith light or a Tannehill type, doesn't make a lot of mistakes, low risk, low reward, but he plays like this where he fucking fumbles and intercepts it and doesn't find the end zone, you're going to be horrible as Jacksonville. And yeah, you can write it off as a bad game, but if you have any Jacksonville player on your team, the offense begins and ends with Minshew basically playing like peak Ryan Tannehill, like how we saw Tannehill play last week with the 4 touchdowns, no picks, great completion percentage. Remember, you don't have to be a flashy, lighted-up quarterback to be effective, but if your ceiling is going to be low, your floor has to be low too. In other words, if you're never going to have the God-tier game, you can't have the game like this where you put up less than 10. Prescott is going to beat this, even though I don't think he's going to have another monster game. Melvin Gordon will do well. I don't think Dalvin Cook is going to do well. I think Minnesota will struggle versus Tennessee. Thing about Cook is like they don't pass that much, so he'll probably find the end zone even if he struggles, so slight edge to Gordon. Chimera buried Ben and carried Cameron last week. Aaron Jones tried to carry Aaron, but it was too heavy, and we see a lot of mirrors this week. This is another. Expect both these guys to break 15. I love this matchup for them. Chimera got a ton of touches last week to the point where Spence even dropped Murray, so Chimera is set to have another huge week. Devontae Parker locked in for 7. Marvin Jones with Galladay banged up against Arizona. I think he'll get 8. I think he'll barely break it. DJ Moore for Carolina. I'm very low on Carolina, and I think if you're going to start a Carolina receiver, it's got to be Robbie Anderson. CeeDee Lamb will outperform more with McCaffrey being hurt. Tyler Higbee. I know some of you more astute viewers might be saying, it's having to click for the first name for every one of these guys. I know 90% of these, and I'm doing it just to make sure and I don't say it wrong. Plus, a lot of these names are ridiculous and like Devontae, stuff like that. When it says D. Parker, I knew it was Devontae, but when it's something, it makes it a lot harder to remember. Look at the tight ends here. Logan Thomas, he had 9 targets last week, which is cute, and he's playing Cleveland, but you got to edge Higbee here on the way better offense. Butker's playing Baltimore. He'll probably do pretty well. Butker is one of those kickers, just like Tucker, where you can sort of pencil them in for having a good week. And if their offense scores 7 touchdowns and no field goals and they just get 7, I mean, whatever. It's still not a terrible week. Greg the Leg, I think, will outperform him. The Cowboys will have to kick a couple field goals against Seattle. Deeply disappointing we don't get to hear the full 12th man Seattle away crowd, even if you're a Cowboy fan. It is fun to watch, even if it does hurt the team. Niners playing the terrible Giants with no Saquon. You have to edge them, even with the Chargers playing against terrible Carolina with no freaking McCaffrey. Both of the defenses should pop off in this game, but you've got to look at this and you've got to edge Cam Joke because, first and foremost, there are no out players in his lineup. So I do think this will be a game that defines Aaron's season, and if he goes 0-3, I think you can almost write off what he did last year as a flash in the pan, even though over a 10-year history he is a good drafter historically, edge Cameron. No Fried and Benny Boy. Jared Allen popped off last week. Mahomes, who is weirdly on No Fried's team. I mean, Ben or AB, what the hell are you guys doing? You guys have got to trade for him. Jared Allen's a running quarterback with a ton of upside. Even though I would be very happy with him if I was Ben, you based your whole identity and season last year around drafting Mahomes. Why don't you offer Allen and someone else for Mahomes? I don't even think it would be a good deal necessarily, but I was just sort of interested to see what would happen regarding that. Leonard Fournette, who Spencer said was just not worth starting, popped off last week. Already spoke about this, but split the difference. Don't expect 20, don't expect 1. Denver's not that good. David Johnson, I mean, they're facing Pittsburgh. He should do pretty well. I'd edge him because he has more certain carries than Fournette, who, even though I don't expect him to do terrible, I wouldn't expect him to do great either. Eckler is going to embarrass Carolina, but Nick Chubb is going to do reasonably well against Washington. I'd pencil both in for a dozen plus. I'd just push there. Evans found the end zone last week. Adam Thielen is a part of a Minnesota team that, like I said, I think is going to struggle. I'm going to edge Evans here. He's facing a pretty weak Denver team. DK Metcalf facing the soft-ass Cowboys defense against Scary Terry. When I look at a guy like Scary Terry, 7 of 10 targets. Anytime a guy can get double-digit targets, that's a great thing. They have no running game. There's no other good receiver. It's going to be hard for me not to look at Scary Terry and say, well, he's going to at least get a lot of looks. And there's a high chance that if Washington does queef out a touchdown, it'll be in his hands. So I'm going to edge him over Metcalf, although Metcalf with his absurd speed could just annihilate the Cowboys secondary, and I wouldn't be surprised. I do think Tyler Lockett will have a better day than Metcalf for what it's worth, although both will probably break 10. Cowboys defense is just dog meat. Cowboys defense in general is not very good. With Van Der Esch going down with that huge injury, you just can't really put any faith into them at all. Van Der Esch is pretty much Sean Lee V2. God tier when he's healthy, which is like 10% of the time. 43 yards here to beat from the flex. Can Josh Brown do it? Probably. He's broken 10 both weeks. Buffalo has developed as a passing team with Josh Allen. Really, even though he just looked like a total immature clown in last year's playoffs, he has developed a lot during the offseason seemingly and has done better. The double Pittsburgh start versus Houston. Houston hasn't been great, but has Pittsburgh been great? I mean, they've certainly looked a lot better with Big Ben. When I compare this to Rodrigo Blankenship, who, even though I watch next to no college football, was one of my favorite college players, the kicker for Georgia, with the goggles, just so fun to watch and ridiculous. Definitely going to edge him versus the Jets. I'm predicting Indy just to annihilate the Jets. There's really no way Indy will lose to the Jets. If they do, the season's over for them, frankly, because it's that much of an easy win with Lev Bell out. The Jets are in a position now where everyone knows they're a joke, and the fans, even though it's 2 seasons in, are already calling for the head of their coach and are checked out. Things couldn't be worse if you're a Jet fan, and things couldn't be better if you were a Colt fan this week. The Jets versus Baltimore, or the Chiefs versus Baltimore, don't love it. So if we're just going to look at this game, I actually expect both teams to do pretty well again. Oftentimes you don't see teams shit the bed and perform poorly until bye weeks come in. Yeah, you'll have weird stuff like where Lilly had Barkley blow his knee out, but you can't predict that. But in terms of looking at the matchups before they occur and saying like, oh yeah, this team's going to shit the bed, there's not really any of that going on. And this is a relatively tough one to call, but I do think that I'm going to have to give it to No Fried very narrowly here, because I think that Eckler is going to go all over Carolina, and I think Metcalf will have a solid game, and the flex is already locked in for a droopy 4 with Jacksonville shitting the bed. We saw Jacksonville's bed shitting affecting several of the matchups already. And in a show where I frequently will just compare one player to the other or one team to the other in one regard, I think that having a small portion of players locked and mixing it up and saying, oh, well, this guy's locked in for 4.3, will this guy be able to go over-under? That is a nice change of pace as opposed to just 0 versus 0 every time. So closing thoughts on the video, which actually turned out to be very long despite being a solo video. Watched it at 1.5x speed, and like and sub for more. Easy.